Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll show you how to handle files. For example, resizing and uploading photos, or uploading large files with a progress bar, and even how to upload into a cloud storage service like Azure Blob containers. First, I'm going to come through the Blazor server car and pass out speed passes to alert passengers who want to get to their destination as quickly as possible. Then I'll walk through the Blazor WebAssembly car and make sure all the client-side passengers can easily get to where they're going to, even if it takes a little longer. And that's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train! All right, so I'm starting with a Blazor server application called File Handling Server. And as I said, I'm going to show you how to do file uploads to both the server and to the cloud for both a Blazor server application and a Blazor WebAssembly application. But we're starting with a Blazor server application. So the first thing we need to do is add a files folder, because that's where the files are going to go on the server. Files. Good. Okay, next thing we need to do is tell ASP.NET Core that we're going to be using this folder, and we want to map the files path, or the route, to the files that are in that folder. So for that, we need a little app.use static files with a file provider for physical files. All right, so now here we're basically just saying, hey, whenever somebody uses the path files, map that to the files subfolder in the current directory, and whatever files are in there, we're going to serve those as static files. Next, we're going to add to our imports razor a couple of using statements. Now remember, this is Blazor server, right? So when we upload files, we're basically just copying them to the files folder. It's actually pretty simple. But as you'll see, it's going to be different for WebAssembly applications. So the next thing we need to do is add a little bit of CSS to our site CSS, which is in the webroot CSS folder. And this is just to support drag and drop. That's right. We're going to do drag and drop file uploading. So we've got a class called drop area, where we're setting it to be 150 pixels, and it's going to be light gray and justified and all that stuff. And now we're going to change it, the color, when we hover over it, to antique white. And when we've dragged something to it, we're going to change the color to dark gray. And the drop area, we're also expressing that this is going to be an input area. So we will accept files. And that's it. So just a little bit of drag and drop magic in the CSS land. Next, let's overtake index razor, as we normally do on this show, to illustrate something. Okay, so I've got an image, right, that I'm showing if we have a URL to that image, because the first demo is just for uploading a photo. And the reason I start with photos is because this is what people typically do in a web application. They want a way to upload photos. And photos generally have special care that needs to be taken so that they're not so big. How many times have you gone to a website and you look at a photo and it's this big on the screen, but it's going like because it's so big? Well, we want to nip that in the bud right before we upload it. So we're going to, before we upload that file, we're going to change it to a PNG file that's no bigger than 400 in either direction. And we have this great little utility built into the file object, or I guess it's called a browser file, iBrowser file, that comes from this guy, the input file component. Now this is a .NET 5 component, right? I know that there are third-party tools out there that do uploads, and even DevExpress, the Blazor tools, have an upload tool. But in .NET 5, Microsoft gave us this input file component, so we can just use that. So here's our div, our drag and drop area, and we're also disabling this input file if we're uploading, and uploading is a Boolean right here. We're going to set it true when we're uploading a file so that the whole thing disables. In other words, we can only do one operation at a time. And look, we've got on drag enter and on drag leave. We've got these methods or events built into input file. So what's going to happen is when we enter drag and drop, we're going to change the class. And when we leave drag and drop, we're going to change the class also. It's just kind of a nice little thing. Now, of course, the CSS and stuff isn't built in, but that's why you wrap it in a div where you have your own CSS. Okay. Next, we're going to list all the files that are in, as URLs that we can click that are in the files folder. All right. So here we go. This is the deal on input file change. This happens when you drop a file onto this div, or you can actually click on the div and a file dialog box will come up and you can select a file too. Either way, you get this method that happens, this event handler on input file change. So what we're going to do is disable the upload pane by setting uploading to true, and you have to say state has changed because otherwise the UI won't update. And again, here's this magic right here where we're getting the resized image file from this request image file async, and we're passing it the format image PNG with a maximum width of 400, a maximum height of 400. We're essentially saying no matter what they drop here, JPEG file, PNG file, whatever, we want to convert it right now, right here, to an image file that is no bigger than 400 by 400 by 400 and is PNG format. So we know it's going to be PNG. So we're going to copy that into a buffer, which we have allocated right here by saying, here's my file, open, read, stream, read async into the buffer, the whole thing. Now it's only a 400 by 400 PNG. It's not going to be bigger than 200K, something like that. So we don't have to worry about it busting the upload restrictions, all right? So we're also going to do this cool thing right here, which is get a new file name with just a little bit of entropy. And it's a common problem in web applications where you're uploading files that if you just write over with the same file name, somebody else could have the same file name and you'd be writing over their file, right? So rather than deal with all that, what we're going to do is take the file name without the path and without the extension, and we're going to add date, time, now, ticks to string to it. And that is the current number of ticks that have elapsed since the time of this instance. And ticks are beyond milliseconds. They're a very fine-grained number. Unless somebody uses that same file name with the same ticks at the exact same time, this is going to be a unique file name. So now I'm just writing to the file. I'm setting the image URL to files / whatever the file name is without the path, and I'm calling list files. Now list files is also called on initialize right here. And basically we have this list of strings, and we're going into all the files in the files directory and turning them into URLs and adding them there. So let's see what we got. There we go. Now I've got this file directory here with some files that I can drag and drop onto that. So let's just do that. I'm going to drag my head up here, and it has uploaded. You can see files, Carl head 140 dash whatever that ticks is right there. And if I want to open that in a new tab, you can see, yes, it's there. So there we go. And I can also do it this way. Right? Now what's also interesting is if I took, these are small files, right? You can see the first one was 9K, the second one, this one is 10K. But what if I took one that's 100K, right? 12,000 pixels by 9,000 pixels. And I drop that in here. Well, what it's going to do is it's going to convert it to a 400 by 400 image and then upload that image, right? So I'm never actually uploading 100 megabytes. Did I say 100K? 100 megabytes worth of picture. All right, let's actually look and see what those files look like. If we open files and open that in File Explorer, yeah, you can see that big one right there, 188K. And that was 100 megabytes at the source. All right, so now let's move on. What if you actually do want to send a 100 megabyte file into your files folder? Well, let's just delete all the files that are in there, and we'll add a new page called Large Files. And just before I forget, so that we can navigate, let's change Nav Menu to support all of the stuff that we're going to do today. We're going to show what we just showed, the large files, and then I'm going to show you how to upload to Blob Storage in Azure. So I have the same photo uploading code here, but I've added the upload large file in chunks code. All of this is the same, except I'm using a different onChange event on large file input change. And my Boolean is uploading large file, but I'm using the same drag and drop, enter, and leave events. I've also got a string that's a message, large upload message, that you can see right there. And I've got a progress bar. And this is using the value of uploaded bytes with a maximum value of total bytes. Both of these are longs, and I'm going to set those in my upload code. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same for the markup. Now, here's my on large file input change. I'm going to reset my uploaded bytes to 0 because we're starting a new upload. I'm disabling the input field with uploading large file. And now here we're calculating the chunks that we have to send. So my total bytes I'm getting from args.file.size, right? And again, this happens when you either drop a file onto that div or you click and select a file from the dialog box. I've got a percent, which I'm initializing to 0. I've got a chunk size of 400K. It's fairly arbitrary. You can tweak it according to your needs and desires, whatever, but I find that that's adequate enough. And it flies under the radar of, you know, hey, this is too much data. So my number of chunks is the total bytes divided by the chunk size, obviously. Now I've got some leftover stuff. So total bytes with the modulus operator, chunk size is going to give me the remainder. In other words, I might have 10 chunks, but I've got some data left over. That 11th chunk isn't going to be 400K. It's going to be less than that. So however much that is, that's the remainder. Now I'm doing my entropy trick with the file name. This time I have to get the extension because I'm not assuming that it's a PNG file. We're getting the actual file name here. We're not resizing it. We can't assume it's a photo. So I've got my file name with my ticks and the extension. And I've got my absolute file name, my local file name. I'm going to delete the file if it already exists in the files folder, which it probably doesn't. And now I'm opening two streams, an input stream, right? My args file, open read stream, and I'm opening my file name for writing with an out stream. So with using statements, I can be sure that both of those are going to be closed after the using statement is completed. Here's my read and write. I'm going through the number of chunks, and for each chunk, I'm reading the next chunk with read async into a buffer. I'm writing it into the output stream. I'm updating the upload bytes, adding the chunk size, updating the percentage, which is a ratio. So the formula there is uploaded bytes times 100 divided by total bytes. That gives me the percent. And then I'm reporting the progress with a string. And of course, uploaded bytes versus total bytes happens to be setting the progress bar. So that's all good. Now, if the remainder is greater than 0, we have a remainder. We might not, but we most likely do. It's the same thing as above, except the buffer size is a remainder. The uploaded bytes is we're adding the remainder to the uploaded bytes, and everything else is the same. So now when it's done, we're saying upload complete. We call list files. Everything is the same. So I've added the same code here just so that you can see how both of these things work at the same time. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, we'll go to large files. All right, so I'm going to take this big picture PNG right here, which is 100 megs. I'm going to copy it into this large file thing right here, and you can see. Now, if I click this, or I try to drop something on it, it's not going to allow me to. But I can still use the first one, the upload photo. Okay, now when this is done, it's going to tell me that it's done, and I see the file is down here, big picture. Let's go look at files, and you can see that big picture is there, and it is indeed 100 megabytes. And it did upload correctly. This is actually a picture from the 2012 .NET Rocks road trip. That's Richard Campbell playing Own This World in the driver's seat, and our driver right there. That was me in the back of the RV. Next, we're going to upload to Azure Blob Storage to a container, but we're not going to leave the files here in the files folder. So I'm just going to delete those. And before we go any further, we need to add our credentials to app settings JSON. Now, this means that you have to go to Azure and create a storage account. When you go to that storage account, you can get a connection string to the storage account, and that's what goes here. And I'm just going to copy mine in. Now, you can see the beginning of my storage connection string. I'm using the account PWOP 6300. That's my storage account. And we have public containers in this account that we use for .NET Rocks images. So you can see that there's like the account key equals and then some blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of bloody after that. I'm not going to show you that. Also, the storage base URL. So this is what people use to access the files in your container. So typically it would be this account.blob.core.windows.net/container name, whatever that container is, / whatever the file name is, or the blob name in this case. So we need some code to be able to access all this Azure goodness. And I've written a helper that I'm going to share with you called the Azure Storage helper. So I'm going to add that to my data folder. And of course, in order to use this, we need to install a NuGet package, azure.storage.blobs. And I'm just going to do a little bit of right clicking right there, and boom, it's installed. Also notice that this is fairly new, just in the last year or so. So if you were using Azure Storage before, it might have been a different NuGet package. Just make sure you have the right stuff. All right, so we're injecting an iConfiguration, which we're going to use to read from the configuration file. You can see I've got the base URL right there, handy dandy, so that I can use it anytime. Let's go down to the bottom here, open container. So this is my storage connection string right here. I'm pulling that out from setting. I'm using that to create a new blob service client from that setting, and then returning a blob container client, passing the container name right? So if all this works and everything's fine, now I've got a blob container client that I can use to read and write to blobs in that container. So get file list, you pass the container name, and it calls container.getBlobsAsync and gets all of the blobs in that container. I'm turning them into URLs and creating a little list of strings, which I'm returning. Upload file, this is interesting. So container name, source file name, dest file name, overwrite. So those are my parameters. The container name, we're going to specify that in the app. The source file name is whatever the local file is that I want to upload to Azure. So before I can upload a file to Azure, it first has to be uploaded to the server. Now we are on the server, okay? So I have to copy it into the files folder. What I don't want is I don't want to have to copy directly from whatever the source file is into Azure. And you know, it's probably okay because everything in a Blazor server application, everything is on the server and all that stuff, but it's just not good practice. And especially once we get to the WebAssembly version of this, you want to copy the file to the server, and then the server takes care of moving it or copying it into an Azure container. That's the strategy here. The dest file name or the destination file name is just the file name without the path information. And then whether we want to overwrite it or not. So we're opening the container with open container. And this is some magic right here, blob upload options. We're specifying some storage transfer options, in particular the maximum transfer size. We're setting to 50 megabytes. Now this doesn't mean we can only transfer a 50 megabyte file. We can transfer larger than that. But if the file is bigger, it will be sent in chunks that are this size. Here's the thing though, when we actually upload it with upload async, we can't do it in chunks. We can't report progress. There isn't any way to do that as far as I know. So you can only just say, here's a file, here are my options, upload it asynchronously. It either works or it doesn't work. So that's what we're doing here. And there's a blob property called delete if exists, which we're setting to true if overwrite is true. And then I have download file, which because we can't upload without being able to download, right? We have the container name, we have the source file name and the destination file name. And we open the container, we get a blob for that source name, and we have our download info, which when we call download async, it returns a download info, blob download info object. And we can use that to download the file and copy it asynchronously to wherever we're going. It's not like streams, but it's what we get with the Azure tools. Okay, now we're going to need this Azure Storage helper in our code, so we're going to inject it. So going to startup. And the next thing let's do is add a page to upload blobs. And that's called blob files. So this is just like the large files. We have our in-stream and our out-stream, and we write to the file. But before we specify what this file is, we're going to upload it to Azure Storage. So I'm getting the base URL from there, the container name. I'm calling my Azure Storage helper to upload the file. Here's my container name. Here's the file name. Here's the new file name without path. And I'm uploading it. And then I'm going to delete the local file, because if we're uploading it to Azure, Azure is our final destination. I don't want to clutter up my server with files that aren't going to be accessed. And in the case of the picture, you know, where the first one, we're uploading a picture, it's exactly the same, except that afterwards we're calling upload file to upload it to Azure. And that becomes our image URL. So let's check it out. All right, here we go. So let's start with just a regular photo. All right, so it uploaded to Azure because you can see we've got this blob file right here. And if we click on it, it's going to download it into our downloads directory. So if I click here, now you can see it actually did go up to my Blazor train container. And if we look in the files folder, there's nothing there. All right, now let's upload the large file in chunks. Again, same deal. Can't click here. Can't drag and drop. We have to wait till this is done. Uploading to Azure, done. Okay. So now let's try downloading that big picture right there. Yes, we can. There it is. And that's 100 megs right there. Okay, that's it for Blazor Server. Let's try to implement the same thing in a Blazor WebAssembly application, which is just a little bit different. All right, so I've created an ASP.NET Core hosted Blazor WebAssembly application called File Handling WASM. A little bit different, but remember we've got the client app, the server app, and a shared app. In the server app, we're going to do the same thing we started with before. We're adding a files folder. And we need to update the startup with that static file information. Now, it should be obvious by now that if you're doing file transfers from a WebAssembly application, you need to have some sort of mechanism to receive those files on the server. And so we're going to use an API controller for that. And before we make the API controller, we actually have to have a class that contains the data that we're going to send. And since we can't send all of the data in one fell swoop, especially for large files, we're going to need to make a file chunk class that is just going to have a little piece of a file and everything that the server needs in order to write that file safely. So because that's an API accessible class, that needs to go in our shared project. So I'm going to add to the shared project a class called file chunk. Okay, so in a file chunk, we've got the name of the file with no path because the server decides where it's going to go. We've got an offset. Now the offset is where in that file we want to start writing. So typically it's going to be the number of bytes that we've read. We have a byte array for the data and then a Boolean first chunk. So we're going to just set this the first time we call, and that's going to give the server an opportunity to look and see if that file exists, and if it does, delete it. So let's make a controller. In the controllers folder, we're going to add a class called Files Controller. Files Controller is going to have the upload file chunk as a post endpoint. And we're passing the file chunk right there. We're going to get the local file name from the current directory files and then the file name no path. And if the file exists and first chunk is true, we're going to delete the file, as I was just talking about. And now we use a stream to open the file for writing. And because we're doing using, that it closes after we're done with this code block here. So we're going to seek to the offset, which is relative to the beginning of the file. We're going to write the data right into the file at that offset and then close it. Pretty simple. And we're going to do that for each chunk in the file. And then we have get files, which is a get, and it just returns a list of strings, which are URLs to all the files in the files folder. Now we need a way to call that from the client. So to the client, we're going to add a files manager. Now I know if you saw complete data in any of the other API things that I've done, you notice there's a lot of stuff missing. So the point isn't to show the API. The point is to show the mechanisms for how file uploading works. I expect you to cross the T's and dot the I's in your own applications. So look, we're using Newtonsoft JSON. So what I'll do is I'll hover over JSON convert, drop down, install package Newtonsoft JSON, and that's done. I love that feature. All right, so here's our upload file chunk. We're calling post as JSON async, and that's coming back as a Boolean, whether it's true or not, whether it worked or it didn't work. And get file names is the get for files, returns the list of files. Couldn't be any simpler. Now, because we have this manager, we need to access it from our code. So in program CS, we're going to add a scope service of files manager. And now before we can use that from our pages, we need to add a couple using statements to import Razor. There they are. Don't forget good old CSS. We need to make sure that we have that in there for our drop area. Now we can start thinking about hijacking the index page. So if you remember, just the regular index page is just uploading a photo and we're resizing it. This code is all the same, except that instead of writing the file directly, now we have to create a file chunk and upload that file chunk. So this is really the only code that's new. All right, so we create the file chunk with the data from the buffer, which is the entire file. Remember, it's only 400 by 400, so it's okay. The file name with no path, we've already got that. The offset is 0. In other words, we're going to start writing at byte 0. First chunk is true. Just upload that whole file as one chunk. Boom, done. And now we have our image URL and the list of files. Let's give it a shot, shall we? All right, so here's our list of files. Let's get the really small one right here and upload that. And hey, what do you know? It worked. Let's try the big one. The 100 megabyte. Yep, that worked too. Took a little bit more time, but that's okay. But guess what? On the client, it was resized to 400 by 400 before it was sent. And that's why it worked. Let's again take a look at the files in the files folder. Look at that. It's only 188K. All right, now let's add support for large files with the large files page. And let us not forget to update the nav menu. Okay, back to the large files page. Whoop. So our regular upload photo is the same. Upload large file in chunks is pretty much the same markup as we had on the server, but the difference is down here. All right. We don't have two streams now. We have one stream, the input stream. We don't have the output stream. So what we're doing is when we've got our buffer, we're going to create a file chunk, add the buffer to that, our new file name without path. The offset is going to be uploaded bytes because uploaded bytes gets updated with every chunk. So that's our offset. And first chunk, we have this variable, which I've set to true before we start everything. And so the first time we call this through, it's going to be true. And then I set it to false. Sneaky, sneaky, sneaky. And now we're just calling files manager upload chunk to make that happen. And the rest of this stuff is the same. The uploaded bytes, the percent, the progress bar. The remainder is exactly the same, except now we're using this buffer, which is just the remainder. Everything else is exactly the same. All right, before we do this, let's just delete all the files in the files folder. All right, I'm going to go to large files. We're going to drop the big file right there and watch that baby go.
We gather here upon this land, every one of us hand in hand. We know exactly where we stand, sharing wood. Open doors are never closed. I give you food, I take your clothes. Damn it, who's got my garden hose? Sharing wood, sharing wood.
There it is. Took a little bit longer, actually, because we're going through the API. It's a testament to how fast Blazor server is, actually. So let's open that file in a new tab. And you can see it just slowly finishing up. That's because it's 100 megs. Big file. All right. So now let's move on to Blob Storage. Again, on the server, we're going to go to appsettings.json, and we're going to put our stuff in there, the secret stuff. We're going to add to the server project the Azure Storage helper class. And we need to install Azure Storage Blobs. We need to add it to the startup. Now we're going to have to modify our files controller a little bit, because the files controller, remember, is going to have to support uploading to Azure. So what's going to happen is the Blazor WebAssembly application is going to upload to the server. Once that's done, it's going to tell the server to upload the file to Azure. And then we also have to have a mechanism to tell the server to delete the local file when we're done. Because you see the whole chunks method that we have, the server doesn't really know that you're done uploading the file. It's just doing one chunk at a time, right? So unless we put some sort of direction into the file chunk itself, and then we would be able to read that, it's a little hokey to me. I like to be specific and explicit about what I want the server to do. So we're going to update this controller just a little bit. So starting at the bottom, upload file chunk, exactly the same. Get files, exactly the same. Now we have a copy to container. So we're implementing copy to container as an HTTP GET. We pass the file name, the container name, and then the keyword copy. And then that is going to call the Azure Storage helper to upload the file to the container name, the file name, and the file name without any path information. And we're saying we want it to overwrite it. Okay. Now we have the delete local file, which we're also implementing as a GET. We have our file name and delete. It just looks to see if the file is there, and if it is, it deletes it. Returns true if it either isn't there or it was deleted. False if it has a problem. And I put these in here in the catch just because if there's a problem during development, you can just put a breakpoint right here and see what happened. So now we also need to get the blob files, which is different than just reading the files on the server. We want to read the blob files from storage. So we need to abstract that away with another get. We're passing the container name and just blobs. So that just returns get file list from Azure Storage Helper. Now, because we have these new API endpoints, we're going to need to change our files manager to be able to support those. Here's upload file chunk, copy file to container. There you go. That's the get async. We have our delete file on server, which is also a get. Files, here's the file name, no path, delete. Get blob URLs. And get file names is the same as it was before. Okay, whoo, now we can add our blob files page. And so what's going to happen again is we're going to upload a chunked file or the picture file. It'll work the same way. We're going to upload a file. After uploading it, we're going to tell the server through the API to upload that file that's local on the server and return us a URL to that file. And then we're going to tell the server to delete the local file. So this is just the photo version. We have our file chunk, which we're uploading just the same. But now, after we upload that file, we're saying copy to Azure. We're calling the files manager, copy file to container, container name, the file name, and that returns the image URL. We can't call the Azure stuff directly from the client because that would require the client to have the credentials for Azure, and we don't want that. We want that all to be protected on the server side. That's why we had to make this API layer. That's why we have to use a files manager to make that call. All right, so if that image URL comes back as anything but an empty string, we're going to tell the server to delete that file and list all the files. And that's what should happen. Now for the chunked big file, all this stuff is the same here as the large file. It's all the same, except afterwards, we say upload complete, sending to Azure, and then we do the files manager, copy file to container. The same thing. Doesn't matter how big it is. We're telling the server to do it. Server can deal with it. All right, now before we run this, I'm going to once again delete whatever file is in my files folder. And I'm also going to go to my Azure portal and delete any of the blobs that are in that Blazor train container. And I just did that off screen, so you didn't see that. But here we go. All right, so let's go down to blob files. You can see there are no blob files in that container, but let's upload a couple of files here. Let's start with one of these guys. There they are, just as before. Now here's the big one. And while this is going on, let's look at our files folder, and you can see that this file is there, big picture, right now. It's only almost complete, but once it sends to Azure, it's going to be deleted. There goes 99, sending to Azure, done, and it is removed from our files folder. And now if I look at that big picture, it's going to download, of course. And let's show that in the folder. And yes, it is 100 megabytes. Booyah. So there you go. We are dealing with files. We're uploading, we're downloading, we're sending to a server from Blazor server application to Blazor WebAssembly application. It covers all the bases, and I showed you how to upload to Blob Storage. Now, just because I showed you how to use Azure Blob Storage doesn't mean you can't use any storage mechanism. Put it anywhere you want. Now you have the point in the code at which you can copy that file to wherever you like. It's all up to you. Back to you in the studio, Carl. You know, uploading a file is a lot like sending your BFF to the cafe car for a freshly microwaved hot dog. It always comes back with mustard on it. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time.
Blaze a train.